just watched the video done by our amazing film department, and I purposefully decided not to show you this video till literally 10-15 minutes before we went live with this. And there's a reason behind this. I actually watched it a couple of days ago, and the emotions, they overtook. And I sat there and I cried for about 5 minutes, because it is just incredible, the kind of footage that we've literally just watched. And it's footage that we have never seen before. And it's footage that was used and recorded by the Germans for propaganda purposes in September 1939.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, our film department's got about 100 minutes worth of this footage, and it's incredible. I mean, some of it's quite repetitive, but it gives you this amazing overview of the September campaign, which is exactly what you were writing about.
Yeah, and it's very strong footage. I mean, the visuals on it are very, very good, and it's well done. It's quality. And I suppose it does, yeah, as you say, on one level, it does give you, a sense of the destruction, a sense of the course of the fight. But in a sense, because I don't have as it were, a dog in the fight. I viewed it perhaps a bit more dispassionately than you did, Alina. And the thing that actually jumped to my mind was that we have to remind ourselves, of course, that it's German propaganda. And also that it's very much from the German perspective, of course. It's telling a story, so it's kind of it's deliberately telling that story of the German victory, and it shows you the tanks and the artillery pieces and the sort of the grinning soldiers, and it's very, very much from a German perspective, as you'd expect. But what frustrated me a little bit about it is that it shows the Poles as very two-dimensional. So the Poles are POWs. They are sort of anguished bystanders. They are, dead soldiers in a ditch, that sort of thing. This actually goes back to what I was trying to do with my book in a way. I think that approach, and as I said, it's propaganda, so that's why it's like that, but it robs the Poles of any agency. All they are is victims. They're two-dimensional. They don't have names. They don't have any purpose apart from just to be bystanders and victims. And in a sense, that's what I was trying to rectify with the book, because that's been the traditional approach. Certainly in the Western, the English-speaking literature on the September campaign, such as it is, which is not very much, is that it always tells the story from a German perspective, because that's where the accessible materials were, the first-hand material. The memoirs of Guderian, for example. For a long time, the Poles were just simply two-dimensional sort of ciphers. They were just two-dimensional figures, victims in their own narrative. That's something I tried to change. I tried to give the Poles a voice. So in a sense, that at risk of sounding like I'm sort of trying to flog the book all over again, but that really confirmed to me that was the reason I wrote the book, was because I wanted to give the Polish side of the narrative and put it out there, so that the next time someone tries to tell the story of the September campaign, they can tell it in a more rounded way, because the material will be out there and will be translated. So it is brilliant footage, I agree, but it sort of really spoke to me, because that confirms to me that was the reason I wrote the book in the first place.
So I want to stick to this idea of propaganda, because literally the first few seconds of the film, you see horses. And I know exactly where I'm going to go with this question here. It is the idea that the Polish fought the Germans on horses and cavalry and against basically tanks. I mean, I want to touch on this myth, because it's a complete and total utter myth, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, it became the sort of standard German propaganda myth of the September campaign as a whole. And it's one of the things I tried to do, is to try and work out where it came from, work out its provenance. Because there's a couple of engagements in the first few days where Polish cavalry engage German troops and are then sort of counter-attacked by armor. So you do have this situation of armor against horses. But of course, it's not the Poles who are charging the German tanks. That's the sort of myth. And that's a myth that's of long standing. I mean, you go back to Andrzej Wajda's film from, I think, 1955, 56, Lotna, which has an amazing scene, again, completely fictitious, but an amazing scene of German Polish cavalry in 1939 charging German tanks. It's a myth, but there we are. It's an extremely long provenance, very powerful myth. So I wanted to actually find out where that story came from, and it came from, managed to sort of track it down to a Italian journalist whose name was Indra Montanelli, and he was embedded with German troops. We would call it embedded these days. He was with German troops not far from the Bzura, in the Bzura campaign, actually, in the middle of the September campaign. And he was brought to the front to sort of, witness the aftermath of one of these engagements. And he evidently saw, what he wrote was about seeing, dead horses, dead men, all mangled together. It's a very powerful piece, but it was published in the Corriere della Sera and given the title Cavalry Against Tanks. And this is obviously, the Germans then could then point to this Italian journalist and say, well, here's an independent source. We didn't write this. We didn't make this up. Other people are saying this. So that this is their sort of original source for this propaganda narrative of cavalry against tanks. And it's a very powerful one when you look at it from a German perspective. The Germans, for their own domestic narrative, but also for the external narrative, want to show themselves as being all powerful in 1939. They want to show themselves as being superior to the Poles in every way. Of course, that's the nature of propaganda. But on top of that, they also have a racial agenda. I mean, Nazi Germany is a racist state. It's founded on the politics of race. So they want to show themselves as superior, and by extension, racially superior to the Germans. So if you can to the Poles. So if you can portray your enemy as being backward, essentially so racially mixed that they're not actually, of any worth. And you can see actually in that footage as well, there's a lot of footage of Jewish men towards the end of that clip. Again, that's part of the propaganda to show, this is the enemy. It's making that racial point to the German people. So it became a very powerful myth, but it's not only technological superiority that's being displayed in that myth, it's also racial superiority, and we shouldn't forget that.
I do want to come back to the idea of the Jewish men at the end, because I find that absolutely fascinating. I did speak to our film department about it, and they've put that in purposefully at that point. But I want to start first of all with Wieluń. Funnily enough, I was in Wieluń the other day, and for the first time, I got to experience and see this beautiful little town that had been completely and utterly devastated. And it was the first target of the German invasion, wasn't it?
Well, was it? It's an open question. I mean, Wieluń certainly was bombed hard very early on the morning of 1st of September 1939. There has been a sort of claim made that Wieluń was hit before Tczew was hit and before Westerplatte was hit. The latter two being basically sort of between 4:30 and 4:45. Westerplatte was 4:45. The raids on the railway bridge at Tczew were just before that, so possibly 4:40 in the morning. And there has been a case made that Wieluń was bombed before that. And I addressed this in the book. I think it's dubious. It's possible. We can't tell for sure, but I think it's dubious. We have to bear in mind that the Luftwaffe records for the raid actually give a time of 5:45, so it's an hour later. But certainly Wieluń was one of the earliest targets, and it's not entirely clear why. I mean, Wieluń doesn't really have any sort of military significance on the 1st of September 1939. It's suggested in the literature that there was some German intelligence that there was a Polish army unit was stationed in Wieluń at the time, but by the time it was bombed, it was no longer there. That doesn't really give them, I think, justification for bombing Wieluń. I think it's what's the most sensible explanation is that this is sort of terror warfare. This is just sort of an attempt to strike terror into the home front to shock and awe. Really, it's the same as very similar sort of effort to the coalition forces against Iraq in the early days of the Iraq War. It's to intimidate your opponent by showing your technological military superiority. So I think it's that. I don't think there's any military justification for Violon, and the timing is disputed. But that's an argument that will probably run and run. But I take the first events of the September campaign to be the bombing of Tczew and of Westerplatte, because I think that's the sort of conventional narrative that is provable. I think Violon's a bit more questionable.
I find it very interesting the time issue, because on the wall in the museum you can see various different memoirs and testimonies and things, and nearly every single one has a different time.
Yeah.
So one says 4:30, one says 4:40, one says 5 o'clock, and you're sitting there and you're thinking, oh, so what time was it?
Yeah, that highlights the problem. With all of these things, when you're dealing with first-hand accounts, memory is a sort of curiously malleable thing. And I always think a human memory is a little bit like a sort of a pudding stone, if you like. It's a sort of an amalgam of different elements. You've got your own sort of memories, and you think that it's rather cut and dried. That's how you remember things. That's how it was. But actually, the brain, to some extent, plays tricks on people. And it does it to all of us. It's not an intentional sort of fib or anything. But you have your own memory, and then you have other events that are related to it, and the distance from the event obviously increases the amount of material that your brain has to assimilate. And your brain sort of creates its own narrative. It creates a story to make sense of the material that it's presented with. So you end up with what you think is a sort of a solid memory, and actually it's a rather more of an amalgam of other people's stories, your own stories, and your brain making up the stuff in between. So it's really a rather malleable thing, which is a harsh thing to say to someone when they tell you they remember it and it was like this. You say, well, maybe it wasn't, because there are always accounts that contradict. So we have to be a bit careful with first-hand material.
So we're talking about Violon. Let's talk a bit about Westerplatte. Can you tell us a little bit about what actually happened there? I'll say same time, but we'll use around the same time. I'll use that word instead.
Yeah, 4:45 a.m. On the morning of 1st of September. And Westerplatte was, every Pole knows the story of Westerplatte, but the outside world perhaps less so. Westerplatte was a sort of spit of land at the mouth of the Vistula, just outside Danzig at the time, which was a Polish, effectively a sort of fortified merchant outpost, if you like. It was during the sort of difficulties of when the Free City of Danzig was set up after the First World War. The Westerplatte was used basically as a sort of secure supply port for the Polish interior, because you couldn't necessarily go through Gdańsk or Danzig, because very often the German dockers would sort of stop shipments that were destined for Poland. So they sort of set up their own fortified merchant outpost, effectively. And that was Westerplatte. So this was always going to be, because it kind of controls the mouth of the Vistula, it was always going to be a target for any German attack. So it was the first target in 1939, 4:45, and it was initially hit by a broadside from the battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which was moored across the waterway from Westerplatte, which was an extremely brutal thing to do. If one ever goes to Westerplatte and you stand there, and if you have a good guide, or hopefully if the museum is up and running, you can ascertain where the Schleswig-Holstein was moored, and then it was towed out into the middle of the channel in the early hours of the 1st of September, and opened fire with all of its 16-inch guns on essentially a couple of barrack blocks and the commandant's villa on Westerplatte. So it's really a sort of an elephant really taking on a gnat. It's really rather one-sided conflict. And that was supposed to sort of soften up the defenders of Westerplatte, and then they would be mopped up by a landward raid by German troops that the Schleswig-Holstein had actually landed as well. So really was supposed to be a very one-sided fight, but the Poles held out very, very valiantly on Westerplatte, fought back against the landward raid that was repeated again a few times over the next few days. They actually held out for 7 days, which is a remarkable story. And it's one that I think really, considering that it is the opening, notwithstanding what we're saying about Wieland, but it's the opening sort of salvos of World War II in Europe, certainly. It's one of those stories that really deserves to be much better known outside of Poland, because it's a truly heroic sort of stand by the garrison at Westerplatte, which is only around 200 strong. And obviously the first military casualties of war are scored there. Some of those defenders. So it's a truly remarkable story. 7 days of resistance against this sort of war machine, which is technologically vastly superior to what the defenders of Westerplatte had. So it's a really remarkable story. It needs to be better known.
So the September campaign is something completely unique at this point, because not only do you have military action, but you have absolute terror being unleashed onto the civilian population. And I think this is something we do need to talk about, we do need to discuss, because this actually shows this in the video that we've just watched, watching literally Poland burn to the ground at the end of the day. And there's an absolutely fantastic scene just at the end where you're at the Saski Palace and you've got all these Poles lined up with a machine gun pointed at them. I mean, it's quite, I'd say, poetic, but it's not in this context.
I mean, I think I would just again correct you slightly, Alina. If you look at the use of terror in warfare, I mean, that goes back, into the mists of time. I mean, look at the rape of Magdeburg, for example, in the 16th century, as the use of terror in warfare. Even closer to the time we're talking about, you've got the rape of Nanking, you've got the bombing of Guernica in the Spanish Civil War. So the use of terror is as old as the hills. I suppose in the case of the German invasion of Poland, it's used, I think, with great deliberation and in a very deliberate manner, key as well, and it has this racial component to it. So I think that's actually what sets it apart. The Germans are going in. This is a regime, as I said before, which is founded on the principles of race and racial superiority, and by extension, racial inferiority. And they are going in with a racial agenda. And this is something I think we tend to forget, in the same way as the Soviets coming in on the 17th of September into Eastern Poland are coming in with a class agenda. They're class revolutionaries in the same way as the Nazis are race revolutionaries. And they're imposing that system, those two systems, on Poland. So I think it's that sort of racial element and combined with the use of terror, which actually sets the September campaign apart. There's often a sort of a lazy assumption, I think, when we talk about World War II, particularly when Brits and Americans talk about World War II, where we sort of assume that this sort of barbarism of the war, the targeting of civilians and so on, we assume that that's something that just started in 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union. But when we tell the true story of the September campaign, as I've tried to do, and you don't just use German sources and you don't just cover it in one paragraph and talk about nonsense like cover against tanks, when you look at the true story of the September campaign, you can see that targeting of civilians, that racial agenda, the racial revolution is already there in September 1939. So there's no galloping barbarism going on. It's right there at the beginning. It doesn't have to develop because of the stresses of warfare. The Nazis are going in already in 1939 with a racial agenda, and they're willing to use terror to put it into place. So I think that's the big lesson to me of that particular conflict. But yeah, you're right. You can see it there. It's actually quite telling. I mean, that scene where it sort of pans across, as you say, the Saxon Palace and so on. And it pans across, you can see there's this sort of, it's a mixture of Warsaw civilians, young men primarily, but a mixture of Jews, non-Jews, all mixed together under the shadow of a German machine gun. And I think the interesting point there is that to the Nazi mind, to the German mind in 1939, there was nothing of Poland that was worth saving in terms of human material, if you like. The Poles and the Jews, to their mind, were so sort of intermixed and intermingled that it was just essentially get rid of the lot. We'll annex the bits that we want, which they did. The rest is a sort of a racial dumping ground, which becomes the general government after October 1939. And essentially, that was the view, that this is such a sort of Judaized population that there's nothing here worth saving. And I think you can almost intuit that from the way those civilians are being treated at the end of that footage.
Talk to us about the statistics of the September campaign, because we've got statistics for the whole of the war. It's approximately 6 million Poles and Polish Jews, Polish citizens are killed. So how many people do we lose in those first 2 weeks?
For the September campaign as a whole, so if you take it to the end of the military operation, which is the 6th of October, 1939. So it's about more or less 5 weeks. The death toll, it's to a large degree, nobody is counting, unfortunately. But the death toll can be estimated, I think, something up to and maybe beyond 200,000, which is huge, and much bigger than I think most people would consider. Military casualties are probably just under half that, and the rest being civilians. So again, you can see from that, the targeting of civilians, whether it's under German bombing or artillery, or, as was very common, the targeting of civilians by the army, by the Wehrmacht, just going forward routinely. They routinely burned down villages. They routinely targeted civilians that they just found in their way. That was the Wehrmacht method of warfare in 1939. I think we have a rather sanitized image in a way. We talk about blitzkrieg as if it's a sort of a sanitized method of war. It wasn't at all. It was extremely brutal. And it meant very often that there was no sort of definable front line, which inevitably means that civilians, women and children, get caught up in the fighting. And as I said, with that racial agenda that we were talking about earlier on, that means that women and children get pushed aside, put up against the wall, put into a cellar, whatever it is, and they become victims of war. So it's an extremely brutal method. So the death toll overall is something like 200,000. German losses are actually relatively small, about 16,000. But the majority, as I said, the majority of other losses are actually civilians. And that tells you something as well.
So, for example, Poles in Poland, we commemorate this event. We remember the 1st of September every year, and some of the bigger, more notable battles that we commemorate. But in Britain, I personally know how to answer this question, but the people don't want to hear from me today. So tell us, Roger, what and how do the Brits remember the invasion of Poland?
I think there are two sort of outstanding images, if you like. One of which would be that myth of cover against tanks. That's still, despite my efforts, still depressingly common. I sort of try and, whenever I talk about the book or the subject, I make a point of sort of telling the story and trying to bat it down and get rid of it. But I think it's of such long duration now and long maturity as a myth. It's going to take a lot more than just my efforts to get rid of it, but hopefully we will. Common sense and historical truth will prevail. So that's one thing that springs to mind. The second one, I suppose, is Chamberlain's speech on the radio on the 3rd of September, where, again, it's very famous. It's quoted in all the history books. You can find the original audio of it on YouTube very easily, where he talks about all his efforts to secure peace have been for naught. No reply from the German government to the ultimatum has been received, and consequently this country is at war with Germany. And it's a wonderfully delivered piece. It's a brilliant piece of very evocative and emotional speech. And I think those two are probably the sort of salient moments that your average Briton identifies with the September campaign. There's very little else beyond that. And as I said, that's partly, I'm trying to correct that. I'm trying to tell, whereas what always frustrates me that we have sort of competing volumes talking about maybe, you know, the Ardennes campaign of 44, or even, you know, complete sideshows like the Dam Busters, for example. You know, it's kind of an obsession of the British and British historians, is this Dam Busters raid of 1943, which is really, I mean, it's really inconsequential, really. I mean, in military terms, certainly. And yet the September campaign has just remained, you know, swept aside and not considered interesting and not considered relevant. And it really is. I think we really do need to get beyond this sort of rather stereotypical image, cavalry against tanks, first of all, and then just that image of Churchill. The September campaign is not about us. It's not about Britain. It's about Poland. And we have to remember that.
So in your opinion, how can we change this? Well, obviously, apart from your well-written and well-researched book, how do you think we can change this?
Keep doing what we're doing. I think, you know, that again, you know, us doing this podcast now is a good thing. We have to keep pushing that narrative. As I said, it's frustrated me for a long time that it's seen through, certainly in the Anglo-American sort of narrative of the war, it's seen very much through a British lens. You know, one book I read a long time ago took this to a ridiculous extent, where it purports to be a book about the opening years of World War II, and when it talks about the September campaign, there's no mention of the Poles fighting the Germans on the ground in Poland. And actually, the narrative is about British agonies and how the politicians agonize about going to war again, how news of the outbreak of war is received, you know, on the cricket pitches of the South Downs. I mean, it's ludicrously Anglo-centric. And we have to get away from that. We you know, British historiography is actually quite good at not being parochial and actually embracing sort of narratives where we're not even involved. You look at Anthony Beevor's Stalingrad. It's a great example of a narrative where Britain isn't involved, and yet it became a bestseller. You know, everybody knows how gruesome the Battle for Stalingrad was, courtesy of Anthony Beevor and others. But we're quite good at this stuff. But there's still a black spot, a blind spot when it comes to, I think, to Polish matters, but particularly the September campaign. So we just have to keep telling the story. We have to keep telling that truth and saying, you know, September 39 is not about us. It's not about Chamberlain. It's about what's going on in Poland. And we have to keep plugging that away.
So if you've been interested in what we've been talking about today, I highly recommend you go out and grab yourself a copy. It's available. How many languages is it available at the moment?
It's in Polish, UK edition and US edition. So the Polish edition is I'll do it in Polish. 1939, Polska. 1939. I practiced that, you can tell. The US edition is also titled Poland 1939. And the UK edition is titled First to Fight.
I do highly recommend you go out and grab yourselves a copy. I love the book, very well written. And we'll be seeing much more exciting things from you soon, Roger, won't we?
We will indeed. I'm working on another book at the moment. So yes, keep your eyes peeled for that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Alina.